Well, tonight we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to begin at verse 23, and we will go through chapter 2 and verse 4. You remember last week we were talking about verses 12 to 22, where Paul begins Paul talks about really the first part of the body of the letter. And he discusses the change of plans. You remember there is this problem. The Corinthians think Paul is fickle or unreliable. You know, he keeps changing his mind. He doesn't keep his promise. He tells us he's going to come and then he doesn't come. And he tells us he's going to go through Macedonia and then he comes straight over. You know, all this unreliability as they perceive it. Remember, Paul said, well, it's not unreliability. Rather, I'm faithful to God's intent here. You know, I change my plans not according to human wisdom, but according to the grace of God. I change my plan for your benefit, not for my benefit. And that's part of the gospel in the ministry of reconciliation, that I'm concerned about what's going on in your world. And I don't make changes in my plans for my own ego and my own self-interest, but for your sake. Right? So this week, we're going to get a little more particular about what those changes in plans were all about. His first point up last week, remember that point, the main point was, hey, I have a clean conscience, and what I did out of grace and out of my commitment to the ministry of reconciliation. But now this week, I'm going to tell you why I changed my plan. I'm going to explain to you why the plans changed. And that's our text tonight. Beginning at chapter 1, verse 23, through chapter 2, verse 4. But I call on God as witness against me. It was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. I do not mean to imply that we lord it over your faith. Rather, we are workers with you for your joy, because you stand firm in the faith. So I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? And I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. For I am confident about all of you that my joy would be the joy of all of you. For I wrote you out of much distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. Now, as you hear that for the first time, at least in this setting, what are some of the themes that emerge for you in terms of Paul writing this letter? What does he tell us about this letter, or how it was written, what his intent was? This letter that he wrote, the letter we don't have. Remember, there are 4 letters, presumably, although that's debated in various ways. But we have a letter, 1 Corinthians, right? And we have a letter before 1 Corinthians. So we have letter A and B, and letter B is 1 Corinthians, and letter C is the letter we're talking about right here. And then letter D is 2 Corinthians. Now, some think the letter that we're talking about here, letter C, is actually part of 2 Corinthians, like chapters 10 to 13. Because it was not an uncommon thing to combine letters and put them on one scroll. You know, that would not be a weird thing, because after all, scrolls are really expensive, right? These papyrus scrolls. So you put as much on there as you can. So some scholars think that maybe 2 Corinthians chapter 10 to 13 was this letter that he's talking about here. And that when they were putting these letters down and put them in a collection, and you have a collection of letters from Paul, that somehow this got stuck to the end of one, and we've just received it as one letter when really it's two. Maybe, probably not, in my opinion, but certainly possible. But whatever that, we don't know for sure about that. But whatever the case is, he's telling us about this letter here. So what are we hearing about this letter? What do you hear about this letter?
That the people strayed away from his teachings originally.
Okay, so there was some kind of distance between Paul and the Corinthians, that they had strayed away from his teaching, or they had rejected him, or that something put this distance between them that created, what's his word? How many times do you use this word? Pain. That's used quite it's all about pain here. A lot of pain, and painful visit, pain, I don't want to cause you pain, or grief. It's really the word grief. I don't want to grieve you. So the word pain here and the word grief are really, those are in the same world. Some translations may say grief instead of pain. So there's some distance between Paul and Corinth, which creates pain. What else does he tell us about this letter? Anything else you pick up on?
He wrote it out of love and concern for them.
Yeah, it's written out of love. And in fact, he thinks that they should be able to tell from reading the letter that Paul loves them. Which is an interesting statement, because the letter is written in this hostile or tension-filled situation. And yet Paul's idea is that his letter is really an evidence of his abundant love, not just a little love. It's an abundant love for them. Anything else that the letter tells us, or that we hear about the letter?
Well, that he didn't act on his own, but he was led by grace.
Okay. He was acting for their sake. He writes a letter for their sake. Because what does he want to avoid? Complications. Wants to avoid complications. He writes a letter to avoid what? Confrontation, but more pain, right? And where would that more pain come from if he didn't write a letter? What was he going to do if he didn't write a letter? He was going to go to Corinth, right? And in going to Corinth, that would have been an even more painful situation. Right? It's like Paul was there, and he called that a painful visit. There must have been something really harmful, wounding, hurtful about that experience for Paul and them. They both came away hurting. You probably had meetings like that, right? Where you're together and then you both walk away and you're both hurting. It's like it didn't get resolved. It's still laying out there. It's still a problem. There's no reconciliation. And without reconciliation, there's pain. And Paul is involved in a ministry of reconciliation. If that's his heart, that's his message, that's his life. And yet this church that he planted, that he founded, this church that he's the father of, as 1 Corinthians 14 says, I begat you, right? I'm your father, you are my children. And you can pour all those metaphors into that pot of pain that he feels. Whether it's the pain of children, the distance between a parent and a child, or whether it's the pain of just a community that he started and now is, in some sense, opposed to him or struggling with him or accusing him.
And then it was messing everybody else up too.
Yeah, and it spreads throughout the whole congregation, right? Everybody gets affected by it. And so it's breaking up the community. That's the kind of pain we're talking about. So instead of, when he has that visit, he comes back to Ephesus, instead of stewing on it a little bit and then going back, to kind of go back and confront again, or go back and try to deal with it face to face, he decides that it would probably be wiser to write a letter and to give them time to read and reflect and think about what's going on. And because face to face, things can escalate pretty quickly, right? I mean, that doesn't happen to us though, right? I mean, but when we're face to face and we're in a tension-filled moment, we say things we didn't really want to say, or we don't have enough time to think about what we're saying, or we react instead of respond, and it just escalates, right? So Paul, for whatever other reasons might have been involved, travel time, money, whatever. I mean, there might be other reasons too, but I think the bottom line reason is he's doing this out of grace. He's doing this for the sake of the ministry of reconciliation. I'm going to send a letter instead of going in person. And when he writes this letter, it addresses the problem out of love, but it's a painful thing to do. It grieves him. I mean, what's some of the language that describes how he's writing this letter? He kind of piles it up on us, doesn't he? There in verse 4, chapter 2. What kind of window do we get into Paul's heart?
He's hurting. He's crying.
He's crying, he's hurting, he's filled with anxiety, he's anguishing, agonizing.
He's shedding tears.
Shedding tears. Yeah, this is real to Paul. These are his children, you might say. And he is very hurt. Maybe not so much for his own, not out of his own ego, but he's hurt about the distance, the tension, the lack of joy. Because that's really what he wants, right? If you see in verse 3, when he says, I am confident about all of you that my joy would be the joy of you all. Or as he said right above that, and I wrote as I did so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. I really want a community of joy here. I want a healthy relationship with you. I want to have a relationship where we're glad to see each other, where we have real community. And apparently that's not the case right now. And he says, if I came to you without having the ground prepared in some way, by writing a letter, if I came to you just off the face of it, I'm not sure how that would go. I'm not sure how that would go. So instead of risking a significant deterioration of relationship by a face-to-face meeting, Paul takes another tactic and writes this letter. But he agonizes over it, sheds tears over it. I think we see the real heart and compassion and the passion that Paul has for the Corinthians in the way this letter is written. I don't know if you've ever had an experience where you've written a letter like that just in the writing of it, tears flow down your face. I guess now we write emails and we can do that so quickly we don't have time for tears. I don't know, but maybe we have that as well. There's the depth of emotion here is palatable. You can taste it by reading his language. You see anything else that you want to pay attention to there in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4? I know we took these out of order, but we were trying to get at the point of Paul writing a letter instead of visiting. And one reason we can see is a visit would have been very painful, and Paul wanted to avoid another confrontation face to face. And so he writes a letter. Next week, we'll get a little insight into something of what that letter contained. We'll get a specific in verses 5 to 11. But he doesn't tell us anything much specific here about what it is. Just that he's dealing with something related to that painful visit. Let's say a little bit more about joy here. That what Paul desires is a mutual joy. He says that my joy would be the joy of all of you. Isn't that what we really hope for when we're talking about community? That when we enter into a community or we participate in a community, that we're excited to be there, that we feel a lot of joy in being there, and that the joy we feel is not just kind of, oh, there's some good jokes to be told here, but the joy we feel is kind of a deep relationship, because joy is a word that we don't want to trivialize it by just talking about somebody who's happy. Joy is a kind of a deep serenity, a deep sort of a feeling of relationship that is confident and steady. We have no fear, no suspicions. It's that kind of relationship. We're not always second guessing. We're not always wondering, oh, why are they treating me like that? Maybe they want something, or they got some agenda. Real joy doesn't have that kind of stuff going on. Right? When we really have a joy of just being together.
There's a sense of security.
Yeah, a sense of security in that kind of joy. Absolutely. And that's what Paul doesn't have with the Corinthians right now, right? There's this kind of suspicion on the part of some of the Corinthians. Paul's not a real apostle, or Paul is he's weak. He's not strong. So there's that stuff going on, and so there's some suspicion that just hurts when people feel that way about you. And I think Paul's feeling that hurt. He wants that joy back, the kind of joy that you can imagine would have been when the church first started in Corinth. That kind of joy.
The Lord is what I think of.
Yeah, the joy of the Lord.
In your heart, and when it's in your heart, it's with everybody.
Exactly. Yeah, joy. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It connects.
Yeah, the joy of the Lord in our hearts connects us with each other, right? Because it comes from the Lord.
Right.
But we can subvert that. We can undermine that with our fear and our suspicions and our egos and so on. And so so Paul wants that. He wants to reconnect at a level of joy. Right? So Paul says, y'all, I want you to rejoice over me, and I want to rejoice over you. It goes back to that what we saw earlier, that Paul says, you are our boast and we are your boast. Right? It's that same kind of expectation or hope of relationship, that I can boast in you and you can boast in me, and I can have great joy in you and you can have great joy in me. So again, moving from pain to joy is about reconciliation. Right? It's about the ministry of reconciliation that's happening there. Anything else in verses 1 to 4 that anybody want to speak to? All right, let's go. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Before, when he talks about, I wrote you with many tears, and they have an awareness of this, not that you should be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have, especially that he is could read his, the way he was responding to them as a negative thing. He's
Yeah.
saying this, that you're witnessing, the tears that I've shed for you is because I love you, not because I'm sorrowful about you.
Ah,
I don't know,
okay.
it's just he ties it to the fact that that you might know the love which I have especially for you.
Right,
And it was that love that prompted the tears
right.
in this situation.
The love prompted the tears, right. That's a good point, good way of saying it. Yeah, when he says in verse 4, I wrote not to cause you pain. I'm not writing because I want to hurt you. I'm writing because I love you. But we have to deal with this, right? Sometimes you have to make hard choices to say, we got to deal with this. We can't just overlook it. We just can't bypass it. We can't sidestep it. We can't just, suppress it. We got to look it in the eye and deal with it. When there is a sin problem, when there is a problem that is disrupting the joy of the community, it needs to be dealt with. Now, a lot of us are probably conflict avoiders. We don't like conflict. Well, Paul's not avoiding conflict here. He didn't not go and then not write a letter and just say, oh, well, it'll blow over. We'll just let it sit and forget about it. No, yeah. Paul says, we're going to deal with this. And in fact, what Paul says later in 2 Corinthians in chapter 13, he says, you remember, I told you that when I come a third time, when I was with you the second time, the painful visit, I told you when I was with you the second time that when I come a third time, I will not spare you. In other words, Paul is going to confront the evil in the midst of the congregation. Paul is not going to overlook it, sidestep it, or say it's not important. He's going to confront the evil. And I think that that's a really important, that reconciliation doesn't happen without the illumination of the evil among us. It has to be identified, it has to be named in order for reconciliation to take place. And that's a very important principle that Paul is playing out here. He doesn't ignore the problem. He says, I'm going to deal with the problem, but I'm going to deal with it through a letter for now, instead of going back over face to face. But I'm still going to go face to face eventually. I will go a third time. And he does, ultimately.
So why is the letter less painful than him going?
Well, I think the letter, why is the letter less painful than him going? That's a good question. I think, and here we can only kind of make our best guess, because he doesn't tell us. I suspect that the face-to-face would have degenerated more quickly. But the letter gives people time and space to think about this, something to mull over, reflect on. And you remember, he sends it with Titus. Titus carries the letter. So there is a representative of Paul who is present to help him understand the letter. Usually when you use couriers in the ancient world, the courier, didn't have a mail system, right? And you didn't have the U.S. Postal Service, right? So you had couriers, and it would be friends or family or associates or business associates who carried the communication. And when the courier took a letter, the courier usually read the letter to them and explained or answered questions about it. So I think Paul's presence might have ratcheted up the conflict, And so it's maybe a wiser strategy to send Titus with the letter and let them stew on it and address it. And then Paul can come in behind that. I'm guessing, but that seems to make some sense to me at least. Yeah.
23, he shifts from to 24, he shifts from I to we.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, not that we lord it over your faith. What's the it he's talking
I do not mean in verse 24, shifting from I to we is Ron's
about?
question.
Shifts, but it says, not that we lord it.
Right.
over your
I
faith."
do not mean to imply that we lord it over your faith.
What's the it? he's
Well,
referring
I think he's going back up to verse 23, the it that when I come, I'm not going to spare you, right? It was to spare you that I did not come again to Corinth. The it seems to me is, you have to put it in the context of, okay, what are you going to spare them from? What is it you're going to do? And so I do not mean to imply that we lord it over you. We don't lord our authority over you. We don't lord our persona over you. We're not going to force you into something, right? We're not going to coerce you. We're not going to use some kind of oppressive power to fix this.
We're not trying to say we're better than you.
Yeah. Let's go up there. Let's go to verses 23 and 24. I didn't start there, but now let's get back to it. So let's walk through this, and Ron's got a good question there. So let's read 23 and 24 just to get it in our mind again. But I call on God as witness against me. It was to spare you that I did not come to Corinth again. I do not mean to imply that we lord it over your faith. Rather, we are workers with you for your joy because you stand firm in the faith. Let's walk through that line by line for a moment. I call on God as my witness. He's swearing an oath, basically. It's kind of like you say, I swear. God is my witness. And God has been the prominent topic all the way through the first chapter here. Remember some of the things he said about God, like God of mercies, God of comfort, God who establishes us, God who raises the dead, God who is faithful. He said all these things about God, in the first 22 verses. God the Father, our Lord Jesus Christ. So we have these statements about God in the first 22 verses about God's stability, about God's mercy, about God's work among us, God establishing us, and God anointed us, sealed us, and gave us the Spirit. So all this divine activity. And then he says, look, I want you to really believe me. My yes is yes, and my no is no. God is my witness. The witness on my soul is literally what it says. The word life is, some translations have the word life in there, soul. God's going to be my witness. My conscience is clean, as he said earlier. Here's why I wrote the letter. Here's why I didn't come. I did not come because I wanted to spare you. And he says that again in chapter 13, to spare you. In fact, in chapter 12, at the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, he says, when I come again the third time, I will not spare you. I didn't come this time because I'm sparing you. I'm not going to force the issue face to face. I'm not going to make this a dividing line at this moment. I'm not going to exercise my weight. I'm not going to throw my weight around, right? I'm going to spare you. That's why I wrote the letter instead of coming. But then he says, I do not mean to imply that we lord it over your faith. Actually, there's really no it in the Greek text. It's the word that's used for we Lord is a word that is used to describe the reign of a Lord. The Lord reigns. Caesar reigns. The way Caesar reigns is lording, dominating, coercing, oppressive. To lord over someone is to exercise an authority over them in a domineering way, right? A coercive way. So I do not mean to imply that I'm going to come into your congregation. I'm going to come to you and I am going to wield my power in such a way that it looks like Caesar has come to town, and he's going to get his way. That I'm not going to treat you that way. I'm not going to treat you like you're my little serfs, my slaves. Rather, we're co-workers. You're not my slave. There's only one Lord, because the word Lord here is the verb form of the noun form that we use for Lord, Lord Jesus. Jesus is the only one who lords. But even Jesus lords in a servant way, right? Jesus lords by going to the cross. Jesus lords by being a servant, washing feet. So even the lordship of Jesus is not the same sort of lordship of a Caesar that exercises power in order to control. Right? Paul says, I didn't come because I'm sparing you. But I don't mean to imply that when I spare you, I don't mean that my intention is to come into your world and reorder it by my own power and just make things happen and force you into certain things. No. Paul's not going to do church from top down by ordering stuff around. Right? That's not his role. That's Lord Jesus' role, to order stuff. Paul's role is not to order stuff and to force his presence in such a way that everybody has to conform to his presence. Right? Rather, the contrast. Rather, we are workers with you for your joy. Just sit in that for a minute. I'm not going to come into your community and act like a lord. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come into your community and I'm going to work with you. Not for my own interest, not for my own ego, but for your joy. I'm concerned about your joy, your relationship with God, your relationship with each other, your ministry in the gospel. That's what I'm concerned about. And so I'm not going to come in and run roughshod over you and lord over you. I'm going to come in and work with you. And that's why I didn't come. That's why I didn't come right now. I spared you the kind of confrontation that might have arisen, because I'd rather come to you in a way in which we could work together for your joy. Yeah.
I got two. Verse 23.
Sure.
We have multiple places where, your yes, yes, your no, no.
Mm-hmm.
And yet Paul feels it necessary to really summon an oath here
Mm-hmm.
to affirm what he's saying.
Yeah.
Why is it necessary for Paul to do this when we have so much teaching? I mean, it seems in some places to indicate that the oath itself is the Sermon on the Mount. It's something
Right.
that we should avoid, and yet he
Right. Yeah. So Steve's raising the question about if Paul is swearing an oath, how does that jive with or sit with Jesus' statements in Matthew about swearing, or James and talking about swearing in James chapter 2? How is Paul consistent with either one of those perspectives, right? I think that's your question. Yeah, I think in Jesus and James both give us a sense that a yes and a no ought to be sufficient. That really don't have to swear. But what Jesus also talks about is, and in Matthew, was it 23 as well, that it's by what you swear as well. It's, I'm going to swear by the throne, or I'm going to swear by my mother, or I'm going to swear by, my possessions, or that was a way of technically getting out of a swear, because I'm not swearing by God, I'm swearing by something less. So it gives me a loophole. And I think that what Paul is doing is what was very common, that we see Paul doing several times. He'll do it 2 more times in this letter, this kind of oath taking, that it is a way of just underlining the yes, underlining his integrity, and doing it as the witness, with the witness of God, doing it by the witness of God. Yeah. My internet. Hope it didn't go out. But anyway, so it's bringing God into play rather than swearing by something else. Huh?
I mean, I see that he's making a point to
It's in-
people that he wants to be sure.
Yeah, emphatic. It's an emphatic
Very
point.
emphatic,
Yeah.
but Still, at the same time, seems to be an unnecessary use. But anyway. That's
Yeah.
kind of tough for me.
I think it's also about the passion of the relationship, right?
Yeah.
It might also be about the intensity of the conflict. You got people not believing Paul. We don't believe you. And Paul says, look, God is my witness. This is why I did this. And
What to do with Are oaths forbidden in other texts? I mean, it's the big,
yeah,
are they actually forbidden, or were they, that people would honor an oath based on what it was made?
right. Honor an oath based on what it was sweared upon. Yeah, so I don't think swearing oaths is absolutely forbidden. I think it's very contextualized in terms of the situation that's envisioned by it, rather than kind of a blank prohibition. Because the blank prohibition just doesn't fit what we see in other places in the New Testament, particularly Paul.
So when he says that in verse 24, for in your faith you are standing firm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like a different group he's talking to than,
Yeah.
about the sorrow he talks about down here in the first 4 verses, affliction and anguish of heart, and yet they're standing firm.
Yeah. Now, that's a good question, because in verse 24, as Steve is saying, they stand firm in the faith, the way the New RSV says it. You could translate that they stand firm by faith. You can go either way. It can be in the faith or by faith, depending on what your translation does with that. I mean, it can go both ways. But Steve's question is, well, how is it that he can affirm their faith when he's having such problems with them? Right? And I think we have to remember that in verses 23 and 24, he's talking about from where he sits right now, having got this news back from Titus, that he can affirm them and also reflect on the kind of, I didn't want to disrupt your faith. I didn't want to disrupt the community. I want to work with you for joy because you stand by faith. We're in this together. We're co-workers in the faith together. Or co-workers by faith. So I think he's referring to the community, that he's addressing the community that he's heard back from. right? That Titus has brought back this news, which he'll tell us more about in chapter 7. Titus has brought back this news, and so he can affirm, because you stand firm by faith. Now, he will, at the end of chapter 13, if you remember, at the end of chapter 13, he will say, examine yourselves to see if you're in the faith. So he'll still call on people to do some introspection, say, are you with us or not? You know, are you a part of this ministry or not? And that's part of it as well. I think that's chapter 13. What is it, verse 5 or 10 or something like that? I don't remember. Yeah, Betty. Yeah.
Do we have evidence that they tried to dominate their beliefs?
That's a good question. That's a good question. The super apostles, were they the sort of people who would lord it over, to dominate? Yeah, that might. Wow. That's a really good question. I'm not sure. I think when we get to chapters 10 to 13, we can look at that closely and see if we hear any hints of that there. That maybe that is. Because one of the ways they would kind of lord is to say, you know, we're a better apostle than Paul is, compare us, see how much better we are, and therefore kind of take control of the community. So yeah, there might be some hints of that. Yeah, that maybe this is an implicit contrast Paul is drawing between himself, who does not intend to lord it over, whereas these protagonists, or maybe that's what they are trying to do. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So I think when we're looking at 23 and 24, we are looking at what Paul, he wanted to spare them, and he didn't want to lord over them, but he wanted to work with them for their sake, because there's something we share, and that's faith. We share faith in the gospel. We share faith. We stand by faith. You stand by faith, Paul says to the Corinthians, which I think, you know, Paul would say he stands by faith too. Yeah. So there's our common ground. We stand by faith, or we stand in the faith. There's our common ground. We ought to work for reconciliation here. We ought to be able to work together because we stand by faith. So we should be able to work together. I mean, if we really believe the story of God, and we really believe in the ministry of reconciliation, we should be able to work together. You know, I mean, I think that's for joy, not begrudgingly, or because I guess we'll have to put up with each other, but because we share something, we should be able to work together with joy. And that's what disturbs Paul right now, because he has such pain about that. When he wrote that second, letter C, the painful letter, when he wrote that letter, there was such grief and anguish and tears over the tension between them. And when we get to chapter 7, we're going to see Paul just express his relief for how this has turned out. Although still got some problems that he's going to address. Right? Well, may the love of God, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all.